Good to see you.
Yes. Can you see me?
Just barely. Yep. Now you're coming into view.
Good. It just came on, and when it came on, it cut out your voice. So I heard that very kind introduction you gave of me, but I didn't hear the specific question that you began with.
How should parents and friends of homeschooling be thinking about defending the philosophical basis for parental rights in education?
Yes, well, I think the way to begin is by understanding that at the foundation of parents' rights, and parents' rights are real, and parents' rights are important, and parents' rights need to be respected. But at the foundation are parents' responsibilities, parents' duties. In fact, parents have rights, including the fundamental right acknowledged by our Supreme Court to direct the upbringing and education of their children, because they have a responsibility to do that, and to do that to the best of their ability. These are not the sorts of rights that we associate with me generation lifestyle liberalism. This is not me stuff. It's not all about my satisfaction and achieving my goals and doing what I want to do. It's about the responsibility to bring up, as best we can, responsible young men and women to be adults who can lead successful lives and be good, contributing, honest, decent members of society. So yes, by all means, let's speak of parents' rights and let's defend parents' rights, but let's remember that the rights are grounded in parental responsibility. Now, why do parents have responsibility? Why not the state? I think that's the fundamental question here.
It is.
So, children are not born into a state. They're born into a family. Look right in the center of your belly. You got a reminder there. The great Leon Cass, one of my mentors under whom I served on the President's Council on Bioethics, used to urge people to occasionally have a look at the belly button because it reminds you of something very important. That is, you had a mother. You didn't come into the world by your own actions. You had a mom, and there was a dad somewhere there in the picture. You're born into families. We do not come into the world, in other words, to borrow a phrase now from Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard, as unencumbered selves, as tabula rasa. We come into the world already encumbered, as it were, with relationships. We come in with mother and father and grandma and grandpa, and sometimes brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. We come in as families. Often we're born into a family that has a faith. We're born into a tradition of faith. That's part of who we are from the very beginning. Now, it may be someday we choose as adults to cast off our family, to leave our family, have nothing to do with them. We may lose our faith or change our faith or abandon our faith. But we come in already as encumbered selves, parts of communities, including very often communities of faith. And this is why, for example, if we can move out of the Christian context, just to look at a very important issue for the Jewish community. This is why our Jewish brothers and sisters are so insistent to fight for the right of male infant circumcision. There's a large movement now worldwide, including in our own country, to forbid male infant circumcision on the ground that it is a violent act against an innocent little boy. Well, you can see that there's a profound philosophical difference there between the so-called intactivists who would deny the Jewish community the right to have their little boys circumcised at 8 years old and initiated into the covenant with Abraham. You'll understand there's a profound difference in worldview between what they see when they look at that child that's born, an encumbered self, a child born into a family, a Jewish family, a family with a tradition, a family with a faith, and the worldview of the intactivists, the critics, those who would use the law, use the state to ban male infant circumcision. When they see a baby born, they don't see a baby with any relationships that matter, that are fundamental, that are deeper than anything the state can claim. They see an unencumbered self, a potential future chooser who should be allowed to grow up and decide at 18 years old whether he wants to be circumcised or not, initiated into the covenant. These are radically different worldviews, radically different philosophies. And it comes down to whether we're encumbered selves or not, whether it matters that we're born into the family. If it does matter that we're born already into those relationships, as I believe it does, as the Jewish community believes it does, as the Christian community believes it does, even ancient thinkers believed in the pagan world that it does, then we have starting to put our finger on the sense in which it is right and true and critical to say that the family is prior to the state. The family has responsibilities and therefore authority and therefore rights to direct the upbringing and education of children that the state simply does not have. The state therefore has no right to veto those decisions made and exercise of that responsibility and duty to direct the upbringing of the children. So if the state wants to come in and say, we're going to take this baby away from this Jewish family because we don't want that baby to be circumcised, and a Jewish family would have its baby, its little boy, circumcised, then we need to say, no, that's not the state's role. That's not the state's business. The family is prior to the state. It's the family that's got the responsibility to make that decision. And that decision may not be vetoed by the state. Now, we all know that there are limits to the authority of families. There are things that are just plain wrong that families ought not to be able to do. And when they do them, the state is right to interfere and even in extreme cases to take a child away. We all know about abuse. This is one of the things that Professor Bartholet at Harvard and her colleagues are worried about. And that's for real. And abuse cannot be tolerated. And there's a role for the state to step in. We refer to that role, Phil, as subsidiary. It's not primary. The primary role is with the family. But the state has a subsidiary role to assist families and churches and other religious communities in the upbringing and education of children. The subsidiary role to assist those who have the primary role. But things go wrong when that becomes a pretext for the state to exercise not a subsidiary role, but to usurp the authority of parents who have the primary role. And of course, that's the great fear that many of us had, I think rightly have, when we read about the sorts of things that Professor Bartholet and her colleagues have in mind. So yeah, we're right to be worried about abuse, but I'd like to hear the same concerns about abuse going on in the public schools.
Of course.
Just as families can abuse their responsibilities, families can abuse children, things can go badly when irresponsible parents misbehave toward their children. The same can happen in schools. Would the Harvard conferees tell us that, well, because sometimes bad things go on in schools, abuse happens in schools, sexual abuse happens in schools, we should therefore close the public schools, shut them down? Somehow I don't think so. Well, the same argument applies in the other direction. We must not allow people to use the reality of abuse, which must be combated and where the state must step in, to become a pretext for the usurpation of parental authority by the state.
When you speak of the view of individuals, of unencumbered individuals, encumbrance might be seen in many cases as blessings. You know, the encumbrance of your family is a blessing. And are we sometimes seeing a clash between those two views, the views of the autonomous self, in which any encumbrance, any relationship is a potential encumbrance, and the view that all of these relationships should be viewed as blessings?
You've hit the nail right on the head, Phil. The fact that we're born into families, the fact that we're born to a mother, the fact that there's a father in our background and one would hope in our lives, those are encumbrances. They are what make us encumbered selves. but not in any negative sense in principle. Now, you can have a bad mother, you can have a bad father, they can be negative, but they're also, and in most cases, I think it's fair to say, a blessing. We really shouldn't want it to be any other way, because human beings are made for life in community, beginning with the community of the family, spreading out to the extended family, including the community of faith, including other communities, what we call subsidiary communities, that assist families and churches and other communities of faith in the upbringing and education of children. Schools, including public schools, for those parents who choose to educate their children in public schools. Those schools are subsidiary institutions that can be helpful. The Latin, as you know, subsidium means help, to help. They're meant to be helpful to the family that has the primary responsibility, but it's important to keep things in proper alignment. We don't want what is secondary to be treated as primary and what is primary to be treated as secondary. Parental authority and obligation are foundational. Other authority is derivative. It's meant to be helpful to parents and families. Parental authority is not derivative. Children are born into, they're parts of families from the very beginning. That relationship, that natural relationship is there. The state is secondary, it's subsidiary, its authority is derivative. It doesn't mean it's real, not real, it is real. Doesn't mean that the state sometimes must step in, the state sometimes must step in. I've already given you some examples of where it's the case. But again, the worry is, let's not let that become a pretext for usurpation. The cult of the autonomous self, what the late great governor of Pennsylvania, the late Robert P. Casey, not the current senator, he's a different character altogether. His father, the great pro-life governor of Pennsylvania, Robert P. Casey, used to refer to this philosophy of the autonomous self that's so dominant, especially in elite sectors of society, as the cult of the imperial self. And boy, Phil, he hit the nail on the head. That's exactly right. It's like a religion. It's a cult. It's a cult of the imperial self, the unencumbered self, the so-called autonomous self. But at the end of the day, of course, that self is not autonomous. It can't even behave as if it's autonomous because it's under the authority of the state. And when we eliminate the authority of the family or the church or the religious community and other institutions of civil society, those mediating institutions that provide the buffer between the individual and the state, then the lonesome autonomous individual is exposed to state power with no protection. Now you're completely under the thumb of the state. And before long, things begin to look like some of those regimes that Mr. Fahey talked about, that we would not want to come to resemble, those regimes that don't allow homeschooling, like Cuba and North Korea.
What are the legitimate interests of the state in education? The state wants its citizens to be literate, to be able to read and write. Where does one draw the line of what's legitimate in state authority over education?
Well, the so-called police powers of states, Phil, extend to public health, safety, and morals, and the general common good. The state is legitimately concerned about public health. We're talking in the middle of a pandemic, a crisis created by the coronavirus. The state is legitimately concerned about that, and it can do things, including restricting liberties and restricting important liberties. There are limits. It's got to be done legitimately. It can't be done arbitrarily or preferentially. But there are things the state can do to protect public health. In the same way, it can protect the health of children if parents become a threat to children's health or do not take sufficient care of the physical health of children so that they are in danger of severe illness. Same with safety. If parents are letting children do things that are very, very dangerous, very, very unsafe, sometimes the state has to come in and say, no, we can't allow your children to take those kinds of risks. Those are those are legitimate. You're also right that states legitimately are concerned with their citizens, including those who are being brought up to be citizens of the state, being literate, being able to look after themselves, such that they will not become burdens on the state unnecessarily. So insisting that children get some basic education, learning to read and write, learning to do basic arithmetic, putting themselves in a position where they will be capable of taking care of their own economic needs, forming families of their own, bringing up children of their own. But here we have to be careful. We must not insist that education must be the same for everyone or for every child. And here the Supreme Court gave us a case in 1972 called Yoder against Wisconsin, which is very instructive. The old order Amish community in Wisconsin objected to having their children be required to go to school, be educated beyond, I believe it was 8th grade. You can check me on that, but I believe it was 8th grade. In other words, they objected to their children going to high school. Their reasons for that in their community was they were concerned that advanced education would lead to selfishness and worldliness and apostasy, and would be damaging for their children as old order Mennonite Amish people, and would in the end lead to the destruction of their community. Children would be in effect indoctrinated in ways that would cause them to want to leave their community. The Supreme Court upheld the right of the parents against the state of Wisconsin, which wanted to enforce its truancy laws against the old order Amish to require kids to go to high school to at least till age 16. The Supreme Court of the United States upheld the authority of the parents on the ground that education doesn't have to look the same for everybody. So long as the Amish, giving their children 8 years of education, train their children to read and write, which the Amish were happy to do. They want their children to be able to read the Bible, for example, and do basic arithmetic of the sort that they would need to do in order to run their farms or run their leatherworking businesses, to lead the sorts of lives that they lead as Amish people, lives that are independent. They do not become dependent upon the state or anything like that. The Supreme Court held that's perfectly fine. That's all we can ask of parents. That's all the state can legitimately ask. It doesn't have to educate children in the way they might be educated in the schools of Greenwich, Connecticut, or Silicon Valley in California, or for that matter, the way it's done in Eastern Kentucky or Southern West Virginia. It can be done the way the Amish community believes it should be done for the sake of their community, so long as the minimum standards are met, which the Amish were more than meeting. And I think there's a lesson for us in that. Lay aside, there's some complicated questions of constitutional law, whether it's the legitimate role of the courts to be carving out what are called conduct exemptions from neutral laws of general applicability. Lay aside those constitutional technicalities for a moment. But just in terms of the political theory of the thing or the moral understanding of the thing, I think here it's very instructive. The court has said, look, education for Amish children doesn't have to look like education for the children of Phil Lawler or Robert George or the children of Elizabeth Bartholet. It can look like education for the Amish, so long as the children in that community are given the kind of education that will enable them to lead fulfilling lives, to not become dependent on other people or on the state, to be able to conduct their personal affairs, read, write, do arithmetic, lead the lives that they will lead.
I don't know if you saw the actual Harvard Magazine article that precipitated this, but it had a fascinating sort of cartoon in it. And of course, the cartoonist views aren't necessarily the views of the author or of Professor Bartholet, but it depicted a schoolhouse or a house in which there were students looking out the window as if they were looking out the window of jail. And those were the homeschoolers. And all around them were frolicking the free children who were having a great time out in the great outdoors. And those were presumably the students at public schools. And anyone who has been involved in homeschooling, I think, would think that that cartoon was reversed. That it's the homeschoolers who generally have much more frolicking going on, working at their own pace, at their own time, more outdoors and so forth. But there's a real difference of viewpoint there about what constitutes freedom. And of course, Professor Bartholet's concern was that homeschool parents tend to be authoritarian. Can you comment on that vision?
Yes, I can. It would have been nice had the cartoonist commenting on the deficiencies of homeschooling. It would have been nice had he spelled the subjects correctly.
Right.
Turns out the cartoonist wasn't very good at spelling. So if he's going to be condescending toward homeschool parents, he might show a little more intellectual acuity than was on display in the cartoon. So that's my first, admittedly rather snide comment. My second one is more serious. I have been a teacher for 35 years, just finished my 35th year teaching at Princeton. As you kindly noted, I've also taught as visiting professor on a number of occasions at Harvard, at the law school, Harvard Law School, where I myself went to law school. I know a lot of Ivy League professors. They're my colleagues and friends. Most of them are wonderful people. I also know a lot of homeschoolers, including some who've been the parents of students of mine, who've done brilliantly, by the way, at Princeton. Mm-hmm. The homeschoolers we admit, I know we were able to be very selective, but boy, the homeschoolers we have had here at Princeton, at least those who've been in my classes, have been a great credit to the homeschooling movement. It's hard to criticize the homeschooling movement when you meet kids like that who are produced by the movement. But anyway, I know through my students and in other ways, lots of homeschooling kids. Now, lots of homeschooling parents, lots of homeschooling people. Now, bear in mind what I said a moment ago. Most of the Ivy League professors I know are wonderful people, good people, and not authoritarians. But if I was out to round up and just to find authoritarians or authoritarian personalities, I think the hunting would be a little easier among Ivy League professors than among homeschoolers. If I were Ivy League, I am an Ivy League professor, and I wouldn't want to be casting any stones from my glass house at the homeschoolers. Homeschoolers are exercising freedom. They're exercising a fundamental freedom, a constitutionally recognized freedom, recognized by the Supreme Court of the United States itself. Now, the Supreme Court sometimes gets things wrong, did terribly in Roe versus Wade and some other notorious decisions. So the fact that the Supreme Court ruled as it did on parents' rights doesn't mean it's necessarily right, but it's worth noting that this isn't some crazy new idea that homeschoolers have suddenly come up with, that there's a right of parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children. The Supreme Court has acknowledged that for getting on now for 100 years, actually. We're pretty close to, we're approaching 100 years of the Supreme Court recognizing that and never actually resiling from it, never backing away from it. So they're exercising a freedom. They're not in the business of denying freedom. I mean, honestly, I see more willingness among homeschool parents to let their children raise questions that challenge their parents' beliefs than I do on many college campuses, where very few in the professoriate or in the academic administration seem to be willing to tolerate students or faculty members expressing dissent from certain sacred doctrines or doctrines that are held as sacred doctrines in the elite sector of the academy, or probably in the academy generally, actually. If I'm looking for violations of free speech or freedom of thought, I wouldn't think to look in the homeschool movement so much as I'd want to look at the Yale campus or the Oberlin campus or one of the University of California campuses. There's where I see the real concerns about free speech and authoritarianism. I mean, that's why organizations, including organizations founded by people who are not conservatives, like Heterodox Academy, have sprung up. they've sprung up precisely because of these authoritarian impulses that seem to have gotten out of control on many campuses in contemporary higher education. So let's not focus on the homeschoolers where we don't have a major problem. Let's focus on where the problem is, and a lot of it's in American higher education.
I think even as a pedagogical issue, homeschoolers, the most successful ones, tend to be a little bit anarchic, I think, in their day-to-day, I want to say classroom work, but of course that's wrong because it's not in a classroom usually. A student might not be, a young boy or girl might not be interested in math today. He might be interested in math tomorrow. And a wise parent rolls with that. And it evens out over time, sort of the same way as one day he doesn't want to eat beans and the next day he doesn't want to eat meat. And over time he gets the nutrients he needs.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of that as well, that with a public school, you can't do that. Math is at 9 o'clock and English is at 10.
I think, Phil, you're onto something here. And I think it's something that that schools, public schools and private schools, can learn from homeschoolers. I was just in a conversation yesterday that involved some friends. It was a webinar that we did in the James Madison program at Princeton. Cecilia Rouse, the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School here at Princeton, who's an education economist, was one of the panelists, and so was the great education scholar at Stanford, Bill Damon. And then the third was an education reform guy named Mike Petrilli, whom I really admire. And Mr. Petrilli was making the point that some of what goes on in homeschool as far as the flexibility is concerned and dealing individually with students and not having everything so regimented, just what you're pointing to, some of what is going on in homeschools can actually be transferred to schools, including to public schools. It's nowhere written in sacred scripture that you have to organize the school day the way it traditionally has been organized in schools, including in public schools. Mm-hmm. There's probably room for a lot of flexibility there. So if I were someone responsible, say as a school board member or a school superintendent or as a principal of a school, again, instead of casting stones at the homeschoolers, I'd want to pay visits to some homeschool houses. I'd want to learn what I could from homeschoolers and see what we can learn from the flexibility we have in homeschooling about what could be imported into ordinary schooling, not with a view to displacing homeschooling. Let a thousand flowers bloom. Let there be public schools and let there be private schools and let there be private religious schools and let there be homeschools. Let there be all sorts of things so that parents can provide the education that is most suitable in their judgment for their kids. But everybody can learn from everybody else. And I think we've got a lot to learn as far as the regular schools are concerned from homeschooling.
Right. And I think that there are times when public schools can interact very positively with homeschools. We had a very positive experience in our family where our son, who was homeschooled, was playing on the soccer team and taking one course at the high school and doing very well, and everybody was happy with it. It was a very productive experience.
There's no reason that homeschool and regular school need to be enemies. They can cooperate. Different kids, different families have different needs. Let people find the kind of education that works best for their kids and for their family. Let a thousand flowers bloom. I mean, this is a really good area, Phil, to be on the side of freedom.
Absolutely.
They don't seem to actually want it in the areas where we should have it. And having parents have the liberty to choose what's best for their boys and girls is really a great thing.
Absolutely. Believe me, Thomas More College has a disproportionate number of students who are homeschooled. And so we're preaching to the choir to some extent here, although only a small percentage of the people who are logged on today are affiliated directly with Thomas More. But it is a vision of society that is family-oriented, community-oriented, and I think very successful. And I think most of the people who are acquainted with it would agree with me there.
Yeah. The homeschooling movement in the United States, I don't know much about the homeschooling movement abroad, but I can tell you here in the United States, it's very impressive. It's moms and dads taking direct responsibility for their obligation to educate their children well. I mean, most parents want what's best for their kids. And so they're going to do what's best for their kids, at least what they judge to be best for their kids. And their judgment is ordinarily going to be better for individual kids than the judgments of people who don't know those children. I mean, this is the big advantage parents have. They don't regard children as a wholesale commodity. Children don't come at them in groups. Even if they've got a gang of kids, even if you have 7, 8, 9 kids in the family, you know each one individually. And anybody who's been the parent of more than one kid, even if you've only had 2, I mean, if you've been a parent of more than one, you are keenly aware of how different your kids are.
Right.
You know, how different they are, and their needs are different. You may have one kid for whom homeschooling is perfect, ideal. You have another kid who may need a different environment, the kind of structured environment you have in a regular school. Mm-hmm. A family may find that for these 2 kids, public school works really well, but for those 2 kids, they're siblings of the first 2, but still for them, they need a private class, maybe smaller classes. Maybe they wouldn't flourish in a public school with 40 kids in a class, but they'll do fine in a private school with 15. And if the parents can afford it, and we should do our best to make sure that parents can afford whatever type of education they think is best for their children. But if the parents can afford it, then it makes so much sense to let the parents decide to put the kids in a private school. And if homeschooling is best for this kid, even if it's not best for that kid, then let the parents make that decision. The school superintendent doesn't know the kids individually. The governor doesn't know. The president of the United States doesn't know the kids individually. They may sincerely want the best for all kids. They may want the best education for all kids, but they don't know the kid. Mom and dad know the kid. Grandma and grandpa know the kid. The priest or minister or rabbi knows the kid. And knowing the kid is crucial if you're going to make the best decision for the kid.
We're back to where you started with the responsibility of the parent. And as you mentioned, we're speaking at a time of crisis, of a health crisis. And my suspicion is that the new normal after the health crisis, whatever that new normal may be, is likely to require all of us to do more to take our own responsibilities, to take care of ourselves.
Yes.
And homeschooling is a way in which a small but rapidly growing number of Americans are taking their responsibility, thinking that, as you say, they know what is best for their child in a way that no one else is ever likely to.
I think that's right, Phil. This is an important moment for the homeschooling movement. And I know those who are involved in the homeschooling movement realize that this is an important moment. A lot of parents are having their first experience with homeschooling. It's not that it's one they chose, but they find themselves homeschooling or effectively homeschooling. Some, I think, will conclude, gosh, can't wait to be done with this and get those kids back into school. Others are going to say, you know, I didn't think I could do this. I can do it. And this is working for Sally, or this is working for Billy. A lot of parents, even if they are going to end up sending their kids back to a school, a public school or a private school, will probably realize for the first time what it's like to homeschool. I think in many cases it will result in increased respect for homeschoolers and at least a better understanding of what homeschooling actually means, what it means to educate your children at home. I think this is also going to generate more materials. And I think the more materials that are generated, the more, let the market work here, let competition drive up quality and drive down prices. Materials, curricular materials, other materials that are available for homeschoolers will increase as a result of this. So that's a little bit of a silver lining here. I think it's an important moment for introspection and reflection by homeschoolers. And by the way, you know, Professor Bartholet and her group, the fact that they have gone very public with their challenge to homeschooling and their criticism, that can be healthy too. If the homeschool movement handles this well, that can be healthy too. And I want to applaud Mr. Fahey and Thomas More and your organization, Phil, for taking up the challenge and meeting it not by, having a fit or having demonstrations or, condemning Harvard or any of that, but rather meeting the challenge intellectually. They have at least purported to want to do business in the proper currency of intellectual discourse, reasons, arguments, evidence. You and those associated with you have responded by saying, fine, let's examine homeschooling using that currency, reasons, arguments, evidence, and let's just see where the chips fall. Now,
Exactly.
I think it's easy for you to do because that's a battle you're going to win because you know about how successful homeschooling parents on the whole have been.
I do. On the other hand, the fact that someone is homeschooling successfully doesn't necessarily mean that that person will be capable of answering the arguments of law professors, which is one reason why I'm grateful to you for spending the time with us today to give people the sort of philosophical background they need to hold their own in conversations with their neighbors, with local authorities, and so forth. So I am grateful to you for being with us. We have a few minutes if I can give you a question or two from our viewing audience.
Certainly.
And to those of you out there who would like to submit questions to Professor George or to our later panelists, please email them to center@thomasmorecollege.edu. That's center@thomasmorecollege.edu. And the first question I received is a bit of a follow-up on something that I asked you. Who should get to decide the limits of state interference? You mentioned states having a reasonable interest in medical and safety concerns, but parents are seeing a lot of overreach in these areas as well. You see parents arrested for allowing children to walk in the park unaccompanied by an adult. The state can easily usurp the responsibilities of parents to make these kinds of normal, everyday decisions for their children.
Well, at the end of the day, we live in a democracy, a democratic republic. We rule ourselves. We, the people, rule ourselves. And among the decisions we have to make as a people, we, the people, among those decisions is a decision about the scope and limits of the power of government at all levels. The scope and limits of the power of local government, the scope and limits of the power of state government, the scope and limits of the power of federal government. Another decision that's got to be made democratically is the decision about what agencies or branches of government are going to, in the end, determine how much intervention in the affairs of families will be permitted. Will it be governors and mayors? Is legislation required? What's the proper role of courts, perhaps exercising the power of judicial review? So what I'm saying to you, Phil, and what I'm saying to the questioner is, these decisions will be made politically. They will. There's no way around that. The question of what the limits will be is not going to be made by me in my classroom or by anybody else in a private capacity. They're going to be made democratically, which means we've got to be involved in a big way in the political process. If we want to prevail on the question of what is and what isn't a legitimate intervention by the state, by the government, in familial matters, if we have a view about what that should be, then we had better get into the public debate and advocate it. We better be involved in politics. We ought to be supporting candidates. We ought to be, where referendum initiative are available, we should be involved in those processes. There is just no other way. I mean, these are political decisions. At the end of the day, they're political decisions, and in a democracy, they're made by we the people. If we don't get involved, if we sit on our hands, if we abstain from political involvement, if we disdain political involvement, then we're going to get a result we don't like at all. And it's going to be more, not less government. I'll assure you of that.
And it will also be inexcusable because the homeschool movement is actually fairly well organized. These are people who know who they are. They have friends involved. They tend to group together to pool resources. This is a tailor-made political movement.
Yep.
and should be able to organize to overcome opposition.
One of the things about a democracy, Phil, is it's our responsibility to persuade our fellow citizens. So we can't be satisfied just to preach to our own choir. The homeschooling movement can't just preach to other homeschoolers. It's got to go out there and persuade people who are not homeschoolers, who themselves choose a different path, who may even be skeptical of homeschooling, probably largely because of ignorance about homeschooling or because of scare tactics that have been used to really unjustly brand homeschoolers as covering up for abuse and so forth. Well, again, in a democracy, it's our job to persuade our fellow citizens. So we've got to go out there and do that. It's not enough just to complain. It's not enough to curse the darkness. You got to light a candle. And that means reaching out, finding ways to reach out to people who are not homeschoolers, who may not be initially sympathetic to homeschooling, and explain to them what the facts are.
One more question, I think. I have heard that the homeschooling movement began among secular families in the 1960s who had adhered to a question authority type mindset. Do you think Professor Bartholet and her comrades are framing the current homeschool movement in that now outdated framework?
Gee, I don't know. As I understand it, the conference in the end didn't come off. The Harvard conference did not come off. I don't know if it's postponed and it's going to happen another time. So we're not sure, what will be said. And I really don't know the answer to that question. One worry I have, and Phil, you kindly mentioned that I served as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. One worry I have is that at least in some circles, what's driving opposition to homeschooling is anti-religious bigotry, especially directed at evangelical Christians and traditional or faithful Catholics. That's really bad. I mean, it's one thing to have a philosophical dispute. I understand that. Reasonable people can disagree about things. Philosophical disputes are philosophical disputes. But sometimes what is depicted as a philosophical dispute is actually not a philosophical dispute. It's prejudice masquerading as a philosophical dispute. And there are some people, I can report from where the little part of the universe I inhabit, there are some people who really don't like evangelical Christians and really don't like traditional Catholics. And they don't like these people being able to educate their children, bring their children up in the Christian faith. And so they see homeschooling as a big target, because homeschooling is one of the ways that parents hand on the faith to their children. Now, I think it's really important that alliances be formed among people who they may have religious differences, nevertheless share a commitment to parental values. We have the development of the classical Christian schools, which I think are fantastic. Homeschoolers need to be allied with them. The Jewish day school movement is fabulous. I have some wonderful students who've come out of Jewish day schools. That's a relatively new phenomenon, at least at the scale that we have it now. The homeschooling movement and the Christian classical school movement need to be allied with Jewish day schools. There are Muslim families in our country now, many, for whom schooling that includes respect for their faith is important. I think not enough Christians are willing to ally with our Muslim fellow citizens, as with our Orthodox Jewish fellow citizens, to make sure that all parents have the right to direct the upbringing and education of their children and decide for themselves whether it's going to be homeschooling, private schooling, religious schooling, public schooling. It's important now, I'll speak as myself a Christian, as a Catholic. It's really important that we not claim for ourselves rights that we don't recognize for other people. The right we're claiming here is not a right for Christians as such. It's a right for all people of all faiths. And we need to be in the forefront of defending the rights of people, whether they happen to be of our particular religious tradition or not. And number one, because it's right. Number one, because it's the right thing to do. And number two, because we're all in this together. And we really will all hang together or hang separately.
Thank you very much. I don't think that leaves us with time for any more questions. I'm grateful to you, Professor Robert George, for giving us your time. and for your helping us to orient and encourage homeschoolers. And I look forward to seeing you again and hearing you play the banjo.
Yeah, well, thank you, Phil. It's been a pleasure and an honor to chat with you and to be part of this event. And best wishes for Thomas More College. I think colleges like Thomas More do a great service to the country, and I wish it only to prosper.
Thank you very much. Thanks again.